Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, U.S. hopes to increase the pressure on China to reach a deal over the 10-month ongoing trade war between the world's two largest economies by threatening to increase tariffs from 10% to 25%. President Trump, in a tweet, suggested China is dragging its feet on reaching a deal and is looking to renegotiate. Meanwhile, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer says China was pulling back from some of the commitments it had made previously with the U.S. Now, according to President Trump, increased tariffs would be applicable on $200 billion worth of goods at an increased rate of 25%, which is up by 15% since February, when there was progress between the two sides. Meanwhile, China has again warned the U.S. ships sailing near islands that are claimed by Beijing in the South China Sea to leave the area. China has warned that U.S. is making provocative moves. But U.S. says that this innocent passage was essentially to challenge China's excessive maritime claims and also to preserve access to waterways that are governed by international law. Since 2014, China has been building islands in the South China Sea. In 2 years, it's turned 7 reefs into military bases. South China Sea is right now one of the world's most strategic locations and has been a contentious issue for many decades, and has 5 countries lay claim to some part of it. We will be talking about the significance of the South China Sea and the rising escalation, not just over who has access and ownership to it, but also the China and U.S.'s ongoing trade war. I'd like to welcome our guests who will be speaking to us about this today. From Hong Kong, we are joined by Mr. Finbarr Bermingham, a journalist. And from London, we have Mr. Jamie Mulholland, a geopolitical analyst in China specialist. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with you, Mr. Finbarr. This issue that has been raised now with President Trump announcing more tariffs, how exactly is this helping the negotiations that were to take place as a 100-member delegation was about to head to the U.S. To talk about the deal?
Well, I don't think it's helping at all. We had sources within the Chinese government tell my colleagues that they had considered cancelling the trip as a result of the tweets. We now understand that the trip will take place on Thursday, probably in slimmed-down format. The trip will be shorter than planned. But, I mean, I don't think there's any suggestion that this helped the negotiations. The reaction was muted in the Chinese press yesterday. However, today there were a couple of quite belligerent editorials in the Global Times and other Chinese state-run media, making the point that China should not make any concessions based on President Trump's tweet storm. So I don't think this has added any sort of any help or any progress to the negotiations. You know, China will not want to be perceived to be weak.
Exactly.
And to be...
So clearly they were of no help at all to the current tensions that are clearly on the rise here as the South China Sea issue is also taking place. But what do you think was the purpose? I mean, I know President Trump, and as we generally understand, he has no real sort of policy when he's tweeting, but there must be some kind of agenda he was at for throwing that out.
My understanding is that President Trump was briefed by his trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, on the latest round of negotiations with China. He was told that China had reneged on some of the commitments it had made in previous negotiations, particularly around forced technology transfer. President Trump did not react too kindly to this, and apparently this is when he took to Twitter to, I guess, to vent his rage. So we don't know whether the U.S. trade representative was blindsided on this. It certainly doesn't seem to be a sort of a policy which was talked through with his, you know, technical staff, that's for sure. You know, when I've spoken to former U.S. trade representative staff, they reckon that the USTR was blindsided by President Trump's tweets. So, I mean, it seems to have been a quite reactionary outburst by the president. without the
usual.
involvement of the trade team.
Right. And Mr. Jamie, what's your take on with President Trump and the general sort of sentiment that there is in the U.S.? Has this got to do anything with China having now officially taken the lead on being a global economy that has surpassed U.S.?
I think it does. I think that China's growing strength challenges the foundation of American exceptionalism, which dictates that the U.S. exports its values to transform the world. And China challenges the idea that you can succeed without adopting Western values. And we see this time and time again when the U.S. challenges Chinese infrastructure, that they don't hold the values we do. And we can't have Chinese companies operating in our country when our values don't align. And that's not something you can challenge with trade wars. And it's not something you can challenge with freedom of navigation exercises. This kind of behavior, it's like going to a protest. You have the right to go up to the police line and to voice your opinion, but if you trip, there could be consequences. Your actions could be misunderstood. So every time you challenge China or another state in this way, with the maritime ships going through the 12 nautical miles, there's always a risk that something could go wrong. And if you look at the cost benefit, there's very little you can gain. There's nothing real concrete that comes through this. This is the third time they've done it this year. They did it, I believe, 5 times in 2017. It's like Trump's tweets. It gets some popular votes. You can get some likes. You can be seen to the public to be doing something.
Considering that it's just away from where he is essentially looking at being voted in again. But when you talk about values that other countries that are trading with the U.S. don't have the same values as the U.S., are these values or are these policies essentially that put U.S. on a sort of a back foot or compromises on their profits? Is that essentially how we should look at it?
Traditionally, it was about democracy and capitalism, but with Trump, it's more about protectionism. So it's a zero sum. Trump needs to win. And this is a problem because Xi Jinping also needs to win. So you have these two major powers where neither is in a position where they can back down. And it would be more beneficial for them to continue the trade war than it would be to appear weak to their own people.
Right. And the commitments that were mentioned that China was reneging on, what is your idea of what these kind of commitments might be? Essentially so involved in the trade talks, and while these conversations were still going on, to come out and say already that they did not, that they started backing from the commitments that they had with the U.S. What could that essentially mean? Because it seems like they really caught China by surprise with this statement.
Yes. Well, some of the things like the transfer of technology is a major thing. And if China makes concessions with the U.S., then it will need to make concessions with other trade partners. However, the U.S. Navy's freedom of navigation exercises gives them an excuse to back off. And Trump is not well known for following through on his promises. So it gives China a bit of leeway as to say, well, it's not all us doing this. We tried. But, the U.S. wasn't willing to make their own concessions. So it just gives them this freedom to move around. It gives them kind of a justification.
Right. So, Mr. Finbarr, about these tariffs now, Trump seems to be under this impression that it's China who pays the majority of these tariffs. Can you clarify who bears the brunt of these?
Well, the tariff is paid by the importing company. So if a tariffed good is sent from China to the United States, then the tariff has to be paid by the importer when it arrives on the docks. That's not to say that there's no cost borne by the Chinese company, because, of course, if there's a tariff on a Chinese good, then a company is less likely to purchase that good. So the immediate cost is borne by the US company, who can then often pass that on to the consumer. We've had a number of, consumer and trade associations come out over the last 24, 36 hours and say that the real loser here is the US consumer. But I think, eventually there will be some trickle down into the Chinese economy. Eventually there will be fewer purchase orders, but there's more of a lag in that. That will take months to come through. But immediately, I guess the immediate cost is paid by US companies.
Consumers. So these raised tariffs, that essentially means higher prices of imported Chinese goods in the US market. Does this also affect the American businesses that are competing with these Chinese products?
Well, a lot of the products are US products. I mean, you have to remember that the Chinese consumer product market in the US is virtually non-existent. Much of the manufacturing in China is done by US companies, is done by, European companies, Taiwanese companies, Hong Kong companies. I mean, you can probably count on one hand the amount of Chinese consumer brands that, are selling well in the United States. So it's not that the US is competing, US consumer brands are competing with Chinese consumer brands. It's that US companies are manufacturing in China and then selling their products back to the United States. So it's not a matter of competing with Chinese companies. It's a matter of, I guess, in President Trump's eyes, of the jobs leaving the US economy and going to the Chinese economy.
So in your view, who is the biggest loser? Are these the American consumers or Chinese businesses? Losers of this trade war between the US and China?
I mean, I couldn't possibly say who's the biggest loser. I think that the consumer may end up paying more. The US company may end up paying more. You also have companies exiting the Chinese market because they do not want to have to pay a tariff in order to export to the United States. So in that way, China is also losing out. But I mean, we will only know further down the line who's the biggest loser from this. I mean, we only really started seeing the effect on the initial round.
If we reflect on the companies that have reported a major rise costs, like Apple did, on that sales had really gone down in China, being a major consumer market for their products. And then also in the vehicular market, we saw General Motors projected a $1 billion extra costs because of these tariffs. And steel also, essentially, and the price of parts like in palladium, aluminum. Does this affect the American economy in a way that could essentially taint Trump's bid for the 2020 re-election?
It can certainly affect the American economy. I mean, you've seen that there has been a hold on investment. For example, for companies that were planning to build factories, it's now about 20% more expensive to build the factory using steel, which is under tariff, as you mentioned. As for whether it will affect President Trump's bid for re-election, I mean, it's hard to say. We saw in the last general election that President Trump seemed to be made of Teflon. He said that at one point he could go out in the street and shoot somebody and people would still vote for him. So whether or not an ailing economy would do for him, I'm not so sure. At the moment, the economy looks quite good on paper. The jobs report was good on Friday. The stock market, although it has taken a bit of a dip this week, has generally been quite strong. So on the face of it, the economy is quite strong. Analysts are putting that down to the tax cut, which will not last forever. So time will tell whether that will see him through to the next election.
Right. And Jamie, the move that the U.S. carriers have made, sailing 12 nautical miles away from China's essentially sovereignty, its islands, in the South China Sea, is this in a way pressurizing China to meet them halfway, or at least do more on the negotiating table regarding their trade deal?
It's a very public act, but it's not unusual. England sails ships through there. As I said, the U.S. is the third time this year. So this isn't a remarkable.
But these were missile destroyers. I mean, essentially, these were not trade or taking cargo sort of ships.
But it's still a public stage. It's still about the presentation. You're challenging China's claim to more than 12 nautical miles. So unless the U.S. is planning to attack, then it doesn't matter what ship is sailed through. It's still a challenge to China's territorial claims.
So you don't see it as a provocative act?
Oh, it's very provocative. Any challenge to somebody's claimed sovereignty is provocative. However, it's just how it's perceived. You're challenging the line. China says the line's here, and America says, no, it's there. But again, I think it's very much for getting the popular vote.
Right, and it's not the first time, is it, that tensions have arisen between the U.S. and China over installations in the South China Sea. This has been going on for a while.
For sure.
Do you see a link, essentially, between this U.S. Perceived aggression in the South China Sea and then Trump's announcement of raising tariffs on Chinese goods?
It's hard to make a direct correlation. These freedom navigation exercises are carried out by different countries throughout the year. However, with the timing, this time it's gotten more attention. As for the raising tariffs, it's hard to say if these are directly linked or they just coincided and as such are grouped together by a coincidence. But Donald Trump has been wanting to raise tariffs more and more to try to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. However, it's hard to say what effect it will have. How will China retaliate? Will the Freedom of Navigation exercises have any impact on how China negotiates? It's very hard to say.
According to the international sea law, if a country is to block international sea trade routes, which should be accessible to anyone for trade, it's projected as an act of war, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the interesting thing is that U.S. is not a signatory for UNCLOS. So the U.S. wants China to follow these rules.
So UNCLOS is the UN Convention for the Laws of the Sea, right?
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little? Could you elaborate a little on what they essentially say?
So this is talking about the 12 nautical miles as the terrestrial waters, and then it's talking about the distance for the exclusive economic zone. This is the law that was used in the case with the Philippines and China. So this is the generally international agreed upon rules for territorial waters and for military and economic zones.
Right.
And the U.S. wants China to follow this. However, the U.S. hasn't agreed to follow it itself.
Which is ironic, as usual, when it's the U.S., the rules don't essentially apply on them, even though they do advocate it. Mr. Finbarr, we're still trying to break down what these tariffs would include possibly. And of course, there's a threat that they would be further increased. Already there's a 15% increase on tariffs on $200 billion worth of goods. Do you have an idea of what these products would be?
Well, the $200 billion worth of goods are already under a 10% tariff, so that would be the existing products, and that's a very wide range of stuff. It's anything from tuna loins to, car parts to, iron filings and stuff like that. The other threat that Trump made on Twitter was that he was going to roll out a 25% tariff on the rest of China's exports to the US. Now, that would probably be more serious. However, that's not something he can do overnight. That's not something that he can do for Friday. I mean, you have to remember that the 25% tariff was supposed to come in on January 1st. Then it was postponed because they had made some progress in the trade talks until March 1st. They made further progress and it was postponed again. So that legislation and that documentation is already drawn up, and the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said that he is going to file that today so that it is activated at midnight on Thursday night, so leading into Friday. However, the other, if they were to follow through with tariffs on the rest of China's exports, which is estimated to be something along the lines of $325 billion US, that would take more time to draw up.
So essentially, if one were to look at it from a point of view of what would benefit, besides the election bid next year, if one was to take a look at it, how would it be good for America to move forward with this, to take China hand in hand, or to essentially reinvent the way they trade with each other? What would you, in your view, be better for the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's not really for me to say what's good for the U.S. I mean, I guess there may be the argument that if the U.S. wishes to decouple its economy from China, that this would be an effective way of doing so. If the U.S. was trying to weaken the Chinese economy, then this would be an effective way of doing so, because, as I mentioned previously, it would drive some manufacturing, a lot of US companies out of China. It would also drive a lot of other international companies and even Chinese companies to move their manufacturing from China. The US would not come out of that unscathed, but the argument is that the US is a stronger economy, so that it can probably absorb more collateral damage than the Chinese economy. Whether it is sheer, political maneuvering, or whether there is any economic theory going into this is hard to know. I mean, it really is hard to know with this administration.
So, Mr. Jamie, the South Sea, we can't really de-alienate the fact that it's so closely related to trade itself, and essentially that's what the bone of contention is between China and the US. I mean, just in South China Sea, there's 11 billion barrels of oil, some 110 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. I mean, this is a very strategic location, and 10% of the world's fisheries are also here. There's obviously more to it than just trying to alert China that what they're doing is wrong by the US.
Yes. As you said, it's one of the most important waterways economically for global trade. It's also in China's backyard, as they would term it. So this is something that's different. The U.S. tends to project power overseas, but there's no disputes they've ever had along their own borders. Mm-hmm. Everything has been in the Middle East, in Europe, in Southeast Asia. But for China, this is right on their back door. So China will not accept having a strong U.S. naval presence in the South China Sea.
And this is another thing that seems to have come up, coinciding not just with the trade war, is that the INF treaty that the U.S. essentially withdrew from with Russia. Meanwhile, as it was involved in decades of wars in the Middle East, China has been stockpiling missiles to an extent that now some U.S. military experts are commenting that they're actually a threat to the U.S., which has essentially had a dominance there in the South China Sea.
So China does have a large stockpile of weapons. I don't think this is terribly significant, because one of the things is they haven't been upgrading their nuclear program. So it takes them a while, something like 24 to 48 hours, to prep nuclear weapons if they wanted to make a strike. Mm-hmm. China has also signed a no first strike, which America hasn't. And Donald Trump is talking about investing heavily in upgrading their own nuclear program. Where China is openly investing is expanding to 3 aircraft carriers, it's nuclear submarines, it's stealth fighters, and it's anti-missile. This is where China is more investing, expanding their blue water navy, the new port in Djibouti. Mm-hmm. So I don't see the arms race in stockpiling of missiles as the issue. Okay. What is more interesting is China's expansion as a blue water navy and its ability to lock the U.S. out of the South China Sea effectively.
Right. And Mr. Finbarr, very quick, just running out of time here, your idea of how China might respond now to Trump's announcement of more tariffs coming up, how do you think they'll move forward from here?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the interesting thing is that China is still planning to send a delegation to Washington on Thursday. Let's not forget that it's not a policy yet, it's a tweet. It remains to be seen whether it will definitely be signed into policy. But, I mean, this was a threat that has always been hanging over the Chinese government and the Chinese negotiating team. So I think that they'll continue to negotiate, and I think that they'll continue to try and reach a trade deal in order to remove any additional tariffs that are put on. I guess if they did start putting the tariffs on the rest of the Chinese goods, then they may be forced to retaliate in another way. They have less room to retaliate because they import less from the US than the US imports from China. So I guess they'd have to think about some non-tariff barriers they could implement. But I think we'll see a continuation of negotiations. China will be very keen to reach a deal.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Finbarr, and also Mr. Jamie, for giving us your time and opinion here on Newswire. With that, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, China won't take part in a three-way nuclear deal with the US and Russia, despite President Trump indicating in comments yesterday that China was eager to join. Now, this could be a major setback for President Trump, who has previously been criticizing the New START treaty with Russia as a bad deal. New START is a nuclear arms reduction treaty between the United States and the Russian Federation that was signed in 2010. After ratification, it came into effect essentially in February 2011. Now, according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, China has about 280 nuclear warheads compared to the thousands held by United States and Russia. But Trump wants not just the reduction of nuclear warheads, but all kinds of missiles and weapons as part of this new deal that he wants Russia and China to join. But as always, Trump is giving mixed signals. Even now, when he talks about arms control and reduction, he's gone ahead and backed the $500 billion Obama-era project to essentially modernize U.S. atomic arsenal, which is essentially why he seems to have pulled out of the INF treaty with Russia. Also, let's not forget that the last time he met the Chinese vice premier, which was just last month, he complained about the staggering military spending by major powers and how that money could be spent on other things. So what exactly is President Trump heading to, and how much of this posturing has anything to do with the immense missile buildup that China has been busy with while America was mired in 2 decades or more in the Middle East? I'd like to welcome our guests who will be speaking on this topic with us. We have Dr. Andrey Kortunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He's joining us from Moscow. And we have Mr. Einar Tangen, a political commentator and analyst, is joining us from Beijing. I want to start with you, Dr. Andrey. The START agreement, which basically capped each side's ability or how much they could deploy arsenal to no more than 1,550 warheads and 700 strategic delivery systems. This will expire soon by 2021 unless it is extended or replaced. After this, there will be no legally binding control over how much of these both nuclear superpowers can make. How much of this is a big concern to President Trump, or is there another agenda on revamping this deal?
Well, I think that for President Trump, arms control is not a top priority. He has never been really interested in arms control agreements, but he should be concerned because if START agreement expires and it is replaced by nothing, then we might have very serious problems with non-proliferation. And we have the next non-proliferation review conference just next year. And I doubt very much that countries which might consider acquiring nuclear weapons will be happy to see that the two superpowers are not ready even to cut down what they have.
And also, it comes at a time which is not very far from when the redacted Mueller report was made public. And it's been less than 3 weeks. And now you see President Trump having long phone conversations on these issues with Russia. How do you see the relationship or the significance of the timing?
Well, of course, it is pretty evident Trump was blocked in his attempts to start a dialogue with Moscow because Russia was a toxic asset for Trump. Trump has been accused of being a quote-unquote puppet of Mr. Putin. And right now, after the Mueller report was ultimately published, and there was nothing suggesting that there had been a collusion between Moscow and the Trump team, now Trump feels more confident he can open, or rather reopen, a dialogue with Moscow without really being so much concerned about his domestic opposition.
Right. And Mr. Einar, let me bring to this conversation, if you could unpack this for us. When President Trump came out and said that he was very happy to and was eager to have China on board. In fact, that while the conversations over trade deal was taking place, they started talking about this three-way nuclear treaty. And then China turns around and says, we're not at all interested. What do you make of this?
Well, what I make of it is that the world has 15,000 nuclear devices, right? Well, any 100 of those could seriously impact the entire world, leading to literally billions of people dying and changing the environment. China has 280 this is the latest estimate, and 90% of that 15,000 is held by the U.S. and the USSR in about equal numbers. So China has just simply said, listen, we don't understand any of this. Once you guys get serious, if you want to bring your nuclear arsenal down to 100 and everyone does the same thing, certainly. Now, remember, there are 5 nuclear nations that are acknowledged, and then you have groups, including Pakistan, India, who are outside, and North Korea, who are outside that agreement. The world is at an inflection point. And if there is, in fact, more nuclear proliferation, you will see an arms race that will put, these types of weapons, I mean, these are world-ending weapons, in the hands of people who are prepared to use them. So Donald Trump is really, I do believe you are correct when you start talking about the political ramifications. How do you change the dialogue that's going on in D.C.? Now, I don't agree that, he has been completely exonerated on the Russian interference. I think Russian interference was, in fact, established. The question was, could they prove that he was colluding, which is not a legal term, or doing something with the Russians to encourage that? And there's been no proof that could stand up in court. I'm a prosecutor. I understand the difference between what you can prove and what you cannot. But the Mueller report still remains in force because of these issues, these 11 instances when it appears he was trying to obstruct justice. I mean, Donald Trump. So Donald is very, very interested in changing the dialogue. He has already not only this nuclear issue, but also the trade issue with China. So you see a very consistent pattern. When he is under pressure, he reaches for some very, very spectacular issue, and he tries to use that to change the conversation.
Right, but at the same time, you think that the U.S. would have maybe an agenda here that while it was busy in the wars in the Middle East, China has been building up its rocket force, which is right now ending essentially the dominance that the U.S. airship carriers have in the South China Sea or generally in the seas. So do you think that could also be part of its reason to try and bring China into its fold here?
No, I mean, Donald Trump's viewpoint is that he wants to rearrange the world around the United States. Think of a bicycle wheel with the U.S. at the hub, and then each spoke going out to the tire being a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and that country, where the U.S. can use its superior economic, political, and military to its advantage to extract the best deal with that particular country. Now, from the other country's point of view, this seems more like he's setting up a kind of Hunger Games world where everybody else is a vassal state behind the U.S. I think Donald Trump is convinced that at this point in history, if he does not do that now, the opportunity passes forever because of a growing multilateral world, which is not dominated purely by the U.S. So in terms of this nuclear things, I think, if he was serious about it, I mean, these are the troubling points. I don't think that it's like most things that there's an overarching plan himself, although those around him, like Bolton, seem to believe in an apocalyptic future.
Right.
He is looking to extract value and to create political points for himself.
Okay. But Dr. Andrey, if that is the scenario, as Mr. Einar has highlighted, of U.S. trying to map the world around itself for its convenience, what stake does Russia has in this nuclear deal that Trump is so eager to construct with them?
Well, the official position that we have here in Moscow is that it is very difficult to resume arms control with the United States unless we address the issue of ballistic defense systems, which is a major concern for Russia. And second, unless we gradually move to a multilateral format. It does mean that we should ask that third nuclear powers should necessarily cut down their arsenals. The future of arms control is not necessarily about reductions, but it is as well about transparency. It's about predictability. It might be about de-alerting. It might be about blocking the most destabilizing pathways for arms race, such as cyber or space or drones or some other innovative weapons.
But it doesn't make sense, President Trump's agenda, the U.S.'s agenda, at a time when just 2 months, 3 months ago, back in February, it withdrew from the INF Treaty.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate, and I think that we will all have to pay a price for that. And there are many reasons why Trump did it. There are allegations that Russia violated the treaty, but there are also concerns about what China is doing, because indeed we know that middle-range systems constitute the core of the Chinese nuclear potential. So it might be considered a preventive step to block the Chinese progress.
While the INF Treaty, it did ban the U.S., Russia from deploying those land-based intermediate missiles, China was in party to that treaty. And what U.S. military officials are now saying is that China has stockpiled a significant number and also capability of these missiles.
That's correct. But of course, China is still far behind the United States and Russia in these types of weapons. However, I think that it would be reasonable for China to offer a different approach. If the United States is concerned about middle-range nuclear missiles, it should consider not just land-based missiles, but also sea-based and air-based missiles. And if you add these missiles to the equation, you will have a very different picture.
Right, but Mr. Einar, analysts say China, as a result of these missiles, that it has been able to stockpile in the time period that U.S. and Russia were in the part of the INF Treaty, and also when U.S. was distracted with its wars in the Middle East. It's now in a position to resist moves of U.S. getting too close to Chinese borders in a way of sort of showing its dominance over the South China Sea. Is that something you would agree with?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, if you start looking at it from a military point of view and start looking at the number of bases that the U.S. has surrounding China, the whole point of the Belt and Road Initiative was to create a land-based backdoor so that you wouldn't have a flashpoint in the South China Seas. Now, it was the U.S. who said consistently that they feel that they need to hem China in to slow down its economy, that it's not the right kind of politics that they believe in, this kind of American exceptionalism where it is all about democracy and capitalism. They see China as a threat existentially because of its success doing that. Now, in terms of China, you have to separate this idea of having missiles and having nuclear weapons. China's nuclear arsenal has not changed. It's 280. It's less than the French. All right. So the idea that China is creating missiles, hypersonic and otherwise, is for defense of its borders. It's very concerned about the actions just recently of U.S. destroyers going within 12 miles of disputed areas in the South China Seas, going back and forth through the Straits of Taiwan. These are not the actions of somebody who's saying, I want peace. These are very aggressive actions. If China was doing the same thing in the United States, or Russia was doing the same things in the United States, there would be red alerts going on. Now, in terms of getting a multilateral system together to start talking about arms reduction. I think everybody should be in favor of that. Russia and China are on very, very good terms at the moment. I'm surprised that the official position of Moscow is that China is not to be trusted, especially given the fact that they're in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is there to fight against all the terrorism, separatism, and all of these kind of radical ideas. So at this juncture, it would seem more important that the two greatest powers, the ones who have 90% of the 15,000 nuclear devices and delivery systems, to cut down what they have. And then when they get to somewhere reasonable, then it would make sense to make this multilateral. Or you can put it all together under one negotiations if the US and Russia were to say, we are determined to cut ours back to 500 apiece, enough to destroy the world a couple of times each, and then ask that the rest of the world obey that, and we start looking at all the issues that my colleague has talked about: defense systems, drones, hypersonic missiles, cyber attacks. These are all real issues that need to be addressed, but they need to be addressed in some way that makes sense, that simply does not continue the kind of two-way race that is going on between Russia and the United States. We saw this in the past, and in the past it didn't work out. Remember, Russia's entire economy is not as great as California's. All right, in a pure economic race, the U.S. would win. That should bother Russia. Russia should be, I would assume, teaming up with the rest of the world who is also bothered this, by the EU, all right, by Japan, by everybody, trying to find some rational solution.
Right. But Dr. Andrey, do you agree here with Mr. Einar?
Well, I agree that definitely the arsenals that Russia and the United States have are excessive. However, there is certain logic in the bilateral confrontation. I think no side wants to make the first step, because that might be interpreted as a sign of weakness and as a result of the pressure from the other side. I don't think that we enter a new arms race between the United States and Russia. And if you look at the modernization programs in both countries, they do not imply any significant increase in numbers of warheads or delivery means. However, we are entering a new arms race, which will be more about quality rather than about quantity, and that might make it even more dangerous.
And why then, in this situation, would China even engage in an arms control deal?
Well, that depends how we define arms control. China is gradually changing its posture. It is becoming more open. It is becoming more transparent. It is becoming more predictable. I think that these are positives, and we definitely keep an eye on these changes. But I think that China, not only China, we can talk about other nuclear powers, might take the initiative in establishing a new set of rules in the nuclear field. Because in the end of the day, countries that have nuclear weapons should not be concerned about their opponents striking them. They should be concerned about nuclear terrorism. They should be concerned about irresponsible non-state actors acquiring nuclear weapons or other types of weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons. This is the real danger, and we should all agree that it is in our best interest to reduce this risk to the sheer minimum.
So, Mr. Einar, what in your opinion would be the kind of move that Russia or President Trump would have to make in order to bring China in its fold, especially considering that relationship with the US and China has been really bad in the past few months?
Well, this is the greatest difficulty, because Donald Trump is, by definition, not trustworthy. I mean, he has repudiated treaties, everything from climate change to this nuclear missile treaty. He does not like multilateral organizations. So it's very difficult to see how you can negotiate with them. Ask Mexico and Canada how they feel about their economic negotiations. Theoretically, they signed a trade treaty only to be surprised that the existing steel and aluminum tariffs are still imposed on them under the guise that they are, in fact, security threats. very difficult for both of those countries to understand. So under this circumstances, no matter what any leader were to do to step up, come up with, right, it's really hard to know how Donald Trump would treat that. He'd treat this as, and I would agree, as a sign of weakness, right, and he would try to push his own agenda. Now, if you take what I say at all seriously, that he is trying to recreate the world around the U.S., how likely is it that he is going to engage in any activity that would weaken that position?
Right. Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have on Newswire for now. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Einar, and also Ms. Dr. Andrey, for giving us your time and valuable input here on this extensive topic. With that, I'll have to bid farewell, and we will see you tomorrow again on Newswire, same time. Till then, goodbye.